we grow weary. I grow weary in the work, or in the war, but not in the work. I love the work, but I sometimes grow weary in the war, but not of the work. I love it. And hope you'll celebrate with us our 35 years. worldviewtube.com/about. Take care.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan, and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Down if they didn't listen to those people who voted. Look, I want to get to this. I know your focus has been on children. There are a huge amount who are missing and exploited. Migrant children under the Biden-Harris administration. And according to an August DHS report, the Biden-Harris administration lost track of more than 300,000 migrant children. Headlines from as far back as last year have been calling out this problem. Former acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf put it this way.
The Trump administration is probably going to have to initiate a pretty large program to find the over 330,000 children that the Biden and Harris administration has lost in the immigration system. We have a child smuggling and trafficking crisis because of the policies of this administration. And you've got to take steps to reduce that and disencourage those children to come across the border to put their lives in the hands of cartel members. You can't just simply sit back.
And look, we have seen the DHS secretary in front of Congress in the last year or so, and they were trying to put forth, well, there are 80 to 85,000 of those children that they know the whereabouts of. First of all, how do you lose 300,000 people who may or may not be legal in this country and are underage? I mean, that just seems unfathomable.
Look, Secretary Mayorkas is an embarrassment to the position he holds. Under this administration, more than 500,000 children have been trafficked into this country, and this administration released them to unvetted sponsors. They stopped the DNA program to make sure these were actually family members. They cut the vetting down to a minimum. Why? Because they were more concerned about overcrowding. Because overcrowding, they're worried about the optics of the crisis. If there's no overcrowding, there's no problem. There's no border crisis. So release these children at record pace. HHS Secretary Becerra bragged on how quick they release these children. So you're right. They can't find over 300,000. President Trump is committed to this. He's got three rails. So number one, we're going to secure that border. At the same time, we're going to do a mass deportation operation. And the third rail is President Trump's committed to finding these over 300,000 children and saving them. Because based on my 3.5 decades of this work, many of these children are sex trafficking today. Many of these children are in forced labor. Matter of fact, we found many in forced labor. And many of these children are living with predators. President Trump is committed to trying to locate these 300,000 children and get them back to their families and save their lives. But it's going to be difficult. Children don't have a digital footprint. They don't have credit cards. They don't pay bills. They don't have a driver's license. So it's going to be tough to find them. So we got to find these so-called sponsors and find out what the hell they did with these children. But President Trump's committed to trying to find every one of these children and saving them.
Tom Homan, I know you are. You and I have talked about this on a regular basis. The incoming border czar, congratulations on that. I look forward to future conversations as we try to move forward beyond.
Every American's mission is finding these missing children. That's what Tom Homan meant. Welcome to Truth Thursday. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube, our X Spaces simulcast, Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon, and Roku. Well, we're going to revisit the missing children issue today as many times as it takes, and for as long as it takes, until they're all found. Look, I'm not naive. Some of these kids are dead, but we have to find them. Some of these kids are being actively used in child sex rings, and we must find them. Some of these kids are being used in forced labor, and we have to find them. And some of these children are simply at locations with people unknown, potentially predators and others who haven't put them into their labor or sex trafficking or child trafficking system yet, because they're holding them. And it's because our government's failed them and failed them intentionally. This issue is at the top of Holman's priority list, and he's right to focus on it, and so is President Trump. If we don't recover these children, our country is a complete failure, because these kids are the future of, they're not only of our country, but the entire Western Hemisphere at a minimum, where most of them come from. Well, my guest today is John Thaler. John is a highly respected and experienced attorney that specializes in investigating the types of corruption crimes we see in places like Arizona, and he's the parent that is a victim of a child trafficking scheme himself. John, welcome back to the Rob Maness Show.
Having me, I appreciate it.
Yeah, so update us real quick on what's going on with you since the last time we talked, especially in the area that we're talking about today. I know you're working in this every day, doing something or another. What's going on?
Well, one of the things that we do, you started off by mentioning, that I have a child in this. I wouldn't quite say my child is in the position of sex trafficking or child trafficking even, but the problem is that my child has been abducted. And, one of the problems is that the resources for trying to get back an abducted child are very minimal. The FBI does have an office that handles, children that are missing, and they're terrific to a point. But when you have a corrupt system with corrupt documents, corrupt orders, et cetera, there's nowhere for parents to go. So one of the things that I created about 2 years ago was something that was originally called the Thaler Project. Now it's called the McKinley Project, named after my child, where we try to help parents all over the country and even all over the world try to recover their children. And we do everything we can, from legal services to support services, et cetera, to try to help them. So right now we have a number of kids that we're looking for. There's a number of kids that we have found that we're in the process of trying to reunify with their parents. And we use all the resources available, including right now the federal courts, to try to get orders and try to get the U.S. Marshal's Office to go seize these children who have been taken and return them to the parents.
Yeah, you're very fortunate because the circumstances that your son was abducted in, and at least who the main players are anyway in that effort. But these kids, do we even know who are these kids? We know they've been brought across the border with illegals or illegally. I'm assuming, but who are these kids?
Well, they fall into two different categories. For children, which is a little bit different than adult, they fall into two different categories. Either they're brought over the border, or a method that we don't talk about much is they're brought over on ship. It is not uncommon at all for Asians to be brought into the country, usually through West Coast ports, especially the San Francisco area, the Oakland Alameda port, to be brought in on ship, usually on container ships, and then snuck in. Usually it for obvious reasons involves bribing officials, at the ports who are bribed to look the other way, and then they're brought in. They're told that they are coming to the United States to make money, that they're going to be domestic help, they're going to be domestic labor, and then what happens is they never wind up, of course, at that kind of destination. And for a state as progressive as California, it is probably the absolute worst in terms of this kind of child trafficking. So, a bunch of them wind up in domestic positions, being essentially work slaves, but the rest wind up being sex slaves. And it is, in the hundreds of thousands that come in that way. And because they're never registered at all through any kind of a border checkpoint or border crossing, you never hear about this end of it at all. The other side of it is, as Holman talked about, with Harris Faulkner, are ones that come over the border. And, when you have an open border, the obvious problems are not just you don't know if terrorists are coming into the country. It's that all other forms of illegal activity come in. Drugs come in, kids come in, harvested organs come in, medical stuff comes in. It's an amazing array of things. We talk about it in terms of, individuals crossing the border, who might be members of gangs, who might be members of terror organizations on the terror watch list. But the fact is that we have all forms of crime that come in anytime you have an open border. And what happened, it's happened over a number of years. It wasn't just with the Biden administration, but the Biden administration made this much worse because they didn't even account for anybody. To the degree that they did account, because of the blowback that was put mostly on Trump about separating children, if you came in with a child, they didn't check your papers. Now, during the Obama administration, you have to give some credit to Obama for doing this. If you came in with a child, however you came in, seeking asylum, came in illegally, whatever way you came in, if you came in with a child, the child was checked for papers. The adult was checked for papers. Do they have matching papers? And if they didn't have matching papers, that's when children were separated from the parents. And rightly so, because this is the only way you can combat child trafficking. What happened was that the outcry of this that didn't happen under Obama did happen under Trump. And they accused Trump of all sorts of ridiculous things for a policy that wasn't even started by him of separating children. And then what they decided to do is they weren't going to do this anymore. So they stopped doing this. Look, if you came in with an adult, as long as you said, yeah, that's my whatever, my parent, my uncle, my aunt, whoever you're coming in with, they didn't do anything further to make sure that these children were really coming in with an actual relative or somebody who had authorization to do it. And so over the course of the 4 years, they literally couldn't account for now 300,000 children. And the number's probably worse than that. But there's at least 300,000 that we know of. And that should tell you something, because those are the ones where at least there was an encounter where you could count the child. You can imagine how many came across that were never an encounter and therefore never even counted. So the number's probably closer to about 500,000.
Yeah, if you include the kids that you were talking about coming in on ships, right? If I remember right, the movie that Angel Studios did about this subject, the way those two, the brother and sister, were transported was in a shipping container that was set up to house them on board the ship. So you think what I thought I heard you say is that that's probably a couple 100,000 at least right there, and they never have an encounter with anybody in the government. What about, I mean, at the end of the Trump administration, we were doing DNA testing to look and see if an adult had a child with them, they were related. So we're not doing that anymore?
We have not been. Now, whether or not that's been started up again, I'm assuming that Tom Homan has done that. But no, that's exactly what the problem was. We don't count the children as being missing if when they come in with a parent, somebody who has a DNA match. I mean, it can be an uncle, it can be a cousin. But if they come in with a relative, we don't count them as being missing. What's happened here is that we release the children along with the parent, and then we have no tracking of anybody. So we have no idea where these children are or who they're with or where they went. And we have no confirmation that any of these 300,000 actually came in with somebody who was either a parent or authorized to bring them into the country.
So if I heard you just correctly, John, if a kid came in the Biden administration with an adult that says they're a relative, or even an adult at all, I guess, then they're not part of the missing number because they're considered in the care of an adult.
Well, the problem is that they kind of are and they kind of aren't. It depends on how you count the numbers. In the 300,000 that Tom Homan is talking about, it accounts for any child who came into the country where there was no verification that the person they were leaving with, that they were being released to, was in any way, shape, or form a relative. Now, keep in mind, there are people who cross the border every day with their children. And when they do, they know to bring some form of documentation, a birth certificate. Remember, these things can be doctored and oftentimes are. But if you bring in documentation that it's your child, they're not counted as being missing in any way. But the problem with the Biden administration is it allowed the children to come in. It didn't check for DNA, as you mentioned. It didn't check for documents. So if the child came in and was with an adult, it went off with the adult. And if you can't find the adult, and as we know, this is a big problem, where we don't know where a lot of these people went, the child is also considered that way. And then, of course, if ultimately they have a hearing date and they don't show up for the hearing date, then, of course, the child is presumed missing. Now, That doesn't mean that all 300,000 are not with a parent, but it certainly means we have absolutely no tracking on them whatsoever. In the case that we just talked about of Asians coming in through ports, coming in by ship and shipping container, we have absolutely no records of them whatsoever. So we have no way to even count them, let alone to find out how they got in or where they are or what's happened to them. What we do know is from raids. We just had a huge raid in Scottsdale, and it coincided with the Waste Management Golf Tournament. Every year, beginning of February, this year was on the day of the Super Bowl. Scottsdale hosts one of the larger, PGA golf tournaments. And every year the police, get in line to go arrest people for child trafficking. And that's not, again, this is not just sex worker stuff. This is children. And they made over 200 arrests in a child trafficking ring, based out of Scottsdale, Arizona. The way in which we get most of our numbers is not by marking people as they come off a boat or come over a border. It's what we find in the raids, and it's how we extrapolate from those numbers, which is a very backwards way to have to do it, but it's the best we got.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, we got to take a break, John. When we come back, we'll see a little clip with Tom Homan talking about this family separation issue. He's got the same perspective I've got on it. I think you'll find it interesting. We'll be right back with John Thaler on the Rob Maness Show. It's Truth Thursday. It's our mission. Find these missing kids that are part of this illegal alien problem.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they have access to all your data? Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldviewtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
I always hear all the time, family separation, Holman's the godfather, family separation. Let me be clear. Zero tolerance is about saving lives. If we figure we start prosecuting people who violate the law and put the children in harm's way, maybe they stop coming. And they did. Numbers went down. It's unfortunate families got separated. But it happens to American families every day. It's going to happen in Albany today that an American family will be separated by law enforcement because the child can't go to jail with the parent. But you want to talk about family separation? 500,000 children on Joe Biden were trafficked into this country. They can't find 300,000 of them. That's a separation. But you know what President Trump's committed? We're going to find them, and we're going to save them, because many of these children are in forced labor, many of these children are in forced sex slavery. We're going to save them. This administration.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Truth Thursday, and what Tom Homan just said there, we're going to find them. We're going to save them, this administration, but also these American people, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take all of us to help find these kids. I mean, this is a dramatically astronomical challenge. My guest today is John Thaler. He's an attorney out of Arizona that works this issue and is very familiar with having a missing child. His own son was abducted and has worked with the law enforcement capabilities that are available. And John, the challenge really is astronomical. We've only touched on it a little bit, the actual challenge itself of how do we find these kids? Have we seen any breakthroughs at all coming from the administration on this issue?
I wouldn't say we've seen breakthroughs. What we've seen is a commitment. One of the biggest problems, as I mentioned earlier, is that there simply aren't methods available, certainly not to families. And with the minor exception of the FBI's abduction unit, which is based in Washington, D.C., and they do a terrific job. With the exception of them, state and local law enforcement is at a total loss here. One of the things that we constantly advocate for and try to work with is getting state and local law enforcement into a room to discuss this issue with them, not just because it's a heartfelt issue, but because they are simply not trained to deal with this. Once somebody leaves a border crossing, or once somebody's off a container ship, like I said, unless you have a task force like they just recently had in Scottsdale, Arizona, the resources available to a parent if you have a missing child, or to just to law enforcement to try to shut this down is very difficult. I mean, I think one of the most unfortunate but most amazing statistics about this is that human trafficking in the United States is second only to drug trafficking in terms of its profitability. It is one of the most profitable industries, and it's the second most profitable illegal industry in the United States. So that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a very sophisticated ring of people who do this. You're dealing with safe houses. You're dealing with networks of like almost like an underground railroad system that takes these kids once they get in here and spreads them out across the country. There are no states, obviously every state has some form of child trafficking, but there are no states that are immune to this at all. And every one of them has their own fair share of sex trafficking for children. So it's a very difficult process, mostly because it is such a business. It is so profitable. And, like I said, one of the ways that we try to bust this is not necessarily to go try to find children. We could do milk cartons, but you wouldn't get very far. One of the main ways we try to do it is to dry up the sources of how they move money, the sources of the residences that are used to do this. So if we can cut down on the Underground Railroad, if we can cut down on the ability to move money through the system, if we can work through banks and financial institutions to flag this stuff, we have a much better shot at kind of working it backwards than trying to work it with posters. I mean, can you imagine, you see the posters on milk cartons from years ago, but we're talking 500,000 children in this country. How are you going to find them? Yeah. It's very difficult. The other thing we've tried to do, and I know that Homan has tried to do this, and I think there's a move toward this, is also going to the schools for kids who are not being sexually trafficked, so they're not being kept at home. One way, is through the fake adoptions. There's a lot of fake adoption process where kids get adopted. So they're not necessarily being exploited, but they are illegally with a family. For those, we can go to the schools and make sure the schools have lists of kids and have these records, et cetera, so that when something comes in that looks like a phony birth certificate, a phony adoption record, anything like that, school administrators are much more on the ball. So these are all things that we're trying to do. It's just kind of trying to greater everybody's education about how extreme the problem is.
On the network you mentioned throughout the nation, that's one of the reasons why the cartels encourage illegal crossings by gang members, right? And they end up in places like the Tren de Agua guys in Aurora and Denver. We saw a lot of gang activity popping up in Omaha, Nebraska when I was working there. And the clip you just saw is Tom Homan is in New York City this week they're starting a major operation up there on the deportation side, and that is so it spreads nationwide because these gangs are organized enough to where they can put pieces of their organizations very rapidly in these major cities. So I guess my next question to you is: do you think that the deportation operation and focusing on the national security threats and violent criminal threats like TDA is going to harm the network and help with that roll up of the network so they don't have a place to keep them or people to
minimally, and let me tell you why. One of the big issues here, of course, is you have to store the kids. You get them across the border, or you get them off a ship. Where do you put them until they go to their ultimate destination? And what happens is that one of the programs that started, roughly about 15 years ago, was the ability of somebody who was illegally in the country to buy a home. So what started happening was that you bring over, if you were the cartel and you got a couple, say a young husband and wife who wanted to sneak into the United States, a perfectly normal thing to want to do, but obviously perfectly illegal. Well, rather than necessarily paying a coyote to take them over, paying $10,000 to try to take them over the border, instead what they would do is they would sign up to be participants in a house purchase. So you have this especially all over parts of Arizona, which is one of the biggest problems they've got in Arizona. On the outskirt areas of especially of Phoenix, you have a lot of inexpensive housing. You have a lot of tract housing, a lot of what we call bedroom neighborhoods. So what would happen is you'd bring in a couple, a young couple, hand them the cash to be able to make the down payment. Banks like Bank of America would then issue mortgages. So now you have a couple living in the house, but the couple wind up never actually living in the house. That's what pays the bill to get them across the border. Their name goes on the paperwork. And that house is then used as a kind of a stash house, for children, for illegals coming over, et cetera. And so the problem is that even if you got rid of the gangs, this is on a much more sophisticated level than that. And that, I think, is the one big failing that we make, both probably at the federal level and the state level. This is a business. It is a big business. And when you're talking about big business, you're talking about $100 to $150 billion in the U.S. alone changing hands over human trafficking, $150 billion throughout the U.S. And in Arizona, you've got, you have about probably about $5 billion for human trafficking and another $15 billion for drugs. So this is a huge, huge, huge business. It is not hard to do this. And like I said, so long as you're using front people, especially, these young couples who have been made allowed to buy homes in this country, you're going to continually have this problem, regardless of what you do with the gangs. The gangs are certainly a part of it, and they've certainly made it worse. But gangs we can find. Gangs don't exactly stay quiet. They don't exactly lay low. We could target Aurora. We could target other cities in the United States. That's not so hard. But trying to find suburban homes where this is going on is extremely difficult. And we've managed to kind of isolate probably about 120, 130 residences in the greater Phoenix area alone that have been used for this kind of activity.
Now, do you do any work with the federal and local and state authorities that I'm sure they have task forces at each level, and maybe even a joint task force out in places like states like Arizona? Do you plug into those organizations and help them?
We do. It's kind of symbiotic, but it's also very minimal in some ways. The federal government has not for a long time, and obviously for the 4 years under Biden, done much of this at all. If you get a specific tip, then it's acted on. And it's not to say that anybody ignores this, 'cause that would be unfair. But in terms of real task forces that go after this, look, we know that every year at the PGA tournament in Scottsdale, there's going to be prostitution, there's going to be human trafficking. So it's easy to set up a task force. But the day after the golf tournament is over, the day after the bust is announced, everything goes back to normal. And I've worked with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department before on this. I did that for a number of years, from about 2010 to about 2012. They were specifically looking at Chinese women being brought over and then being used for massage parlors and for the massage parlor industry in the greater, in all of Arizona, but the greater Phoenix area. But this goes on everywhere. And so, like I said, it's not the priority, unfortunately. Violent crime is not seen this way. And the problem is that if you're a victim, this absolutely is violent crime. If you're a victim of sex trafficking, that's rape. That's assault, that's battery. But we don't see it as a victim's crime the same way we see an actual assault or battery. And look, a great example of it is they just put out charges on the young teenager who was running the relay and hit her opponent on the head with the baton. That gets attention. Yeah. Unfortunately, so many kids being so scattered all over does not get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, I remember Senator Cruz showing the pictures of what are called the rape trees that are full of girls' underwear hanging there and used condoms and packages from the abortion pills that they're given by the NGOs as they come up the trail there and cross the border. I mean, each one of those pieces of underwear represents thousands of rapes and brutalization and many times kids, man. I mean, it's infuriating to listen to you talk about the PGA golf tournament. And we know that the demand for child sex and sex workers goes through the roof at a specific town, at a specific date and time, and we still can't end it. We need to end this. This is slavery. It's really weird that not every American from every background and every race, especially Black Americans, aren't just beside themselves and trying to completely end this instead of going at it piecemeal. I'm hoping Holman's effort helps us get to that, to where we crush it and then we keep it crushed, because it takes constant effort. Well, we're going to take another break, John. When we come back, we'll talk about, I want to ask you get your thoughts on how do these kids get caught up in this stuff? Because there's a bunch of different ways, and then we'll go into what Holman's strategy is, because we're getting a little insight into that now. It's Truth Thursday on the Rob Maness Show. We'll be right back.
Large groups of kids, 50 plus children, they're unaccompanied. You take them in, you have to give them over to the NGOs. The NGOs call somebody to come pick them up. They either pick them up or they fly them into the area where but the NGOs is just a regular individual, a regular employee. So they're not checking to see if that whoever's taking that child is really, a relative or anything to do with that.
And there's been many investigations where some of these children are actually rented by the cartels. If you come with a child, you're not going to be detained, right? So the family groups won't be detained. So they'll rent a child to a male adult, use this child, get across the border, be released. Then the child goes back and be re-rented. Who knows what happens to that child and whose possession they're putting that child in?
Yeah, I've had border guards tell me, I've seen this child come through here 5 or 6 times. I recognize this child.
No, and there's been instances where you've had individuals that come across with a minor and say that it's their child, and when you run their fingerprints, they have a prior detention or they've been detained in another state for some type of child molestation.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. We're talking about how America is going to find these 300,000 plus missing kids that are victims of the previous administrations, primarily the Biden administration, abuse of our immigration laws, keeping our border security down to near zero throughout that term, and how these kids have ended up in this country. And my guest today is John Taylor, an attorney that works these types of issues, amongst other things, from Arizona, and is very familiar with it. John, one of the questions that always comes to my mind when I'm looking at this challenge is, what are the various ways these children get themselves into this circumstance? Some of them are obvious. A parent pimps them out, basically, those kind of things, or they're kidnapped by a cartel member or something. But that's hard to control a kid like that if you've taken them by force. So what are the various ways that are used to get these kids into these circumstances?
Well, the main way, and I think this is very much worldwide, is poverty. When you are poor, when you are the parents of children and you are poor, a lot of bad things happen. And it's not fair to only blame poverty, but poverty is probably the biggest motivator. What they do in Asia, for example, is that they will place ads. These kind of cartels that handle human trafficking out of Asia will place ads. They'll place ads for the family and for the girls. Now, there is a difference between taking somebody who's 8 or 9 years old versus taking somebody who's 14, 15, 16 years old in terms of how this works. But if you're roughly female and you're in your young to mid teens, there isn't any work. You're not considered particularly valuable by your parents. That's part of the culture, unfortunately, still. And so when opportunities come along, like they often do through these flyers that say, you can make money and send it back to your parents, et cetera, you get a lot of people signing up. They don't know any better. They haven't heard any better. They don't know that this is going on. They sign up for this. They get on the boat. And essentially, they then are told that they are now enslaved and that if they don't cooperate, they're going to get killed. The same thing happens going over the border. It's not just Mexico. We think of it as Mexico because that's where the border is. But frankly, this is all through Central America and South America, especially Upper South America, where the same issue goes on, where you have such poverty that your child is more valuable to you working for a cartel or even being trafficked out than they are, in your possession. So because of the poverty levels here, and because you don't have a lot of traditional families, this is the other problem too. You have a lot of births. You have a lot of births out of wedlock. You have a lot of births because a lot of these countries are Catholic, so abortion is not a common practice. They give birth. They can't afford the child. So at some point, it makes a lot of sense to find a way for this child to make your family money. And sometimes it's being sold altogether. Sometimes it's just as the presentation showed. You rent a kid so that a cartel member can get back and forth over the border, with a lot less scrutiny because they have a child with them. So poverty is a big part of it. The other issue too, which we don't talk about nearly enough, is that in the United States, Las Vegas is the human trafficking capital, and that kind of comes with obvious reasons. But I don't mean on a per capita basis. I mean of all cities. So you have a city that's not that big. It's a medium-sized city, but it has the most human trafficking. What often happens in Las Vegas, I have several friends who work this in Las Vegas, who work to find missing and exploited children in Las Vegas. And what they tell me is they say, look, you get a 14-year-old girl who's having problems with her parents. She's going obviously through puberty. She has a whole boatload of psychological issues going on, maybe because of the age that she's at, maybe because of bad parenting. The parents take a vacation to Las Vegas and the child disappears. Child says, I'm going down to the pool or I'm going down to the arcade, wherever they're going, and they literally disappear. And when that happens, I have several friends in Las Vegas who are then called upon to try to find them. Families, use them as a resource to try to find them. And they're very successful at doing this. But, the longer the child is away from the parents, it's heartbreaking what you get back. Because once the child, and this goes for all children, all exploited children, once the child has gotten into the system and is being exploited, that usually comes with drug taking. It comes certainly with sexual performances. It comes with an array of abuses, oftentimes physical abuse. If, the longer they're in it, after about 30 days, it's almost like a lost cause. You may get them back, you may not. And then the years and years and years of psychological counseling that they need, of trauma counseling that they need, can last, like I said, almost a lifetime. They're literally scarred for life. And we don't talk about it so much domestically, but this is a problem. And you actually have, in places like Las Vegas, unfortunately, you actually have groups, including cartels that are here, that basically solicit to them, get them online. There are a lot of things that now go on online where young girls are specifically targeted, and especially if they're going to come to Las Vegas. And oftentimes they'll come, like I said, with their parents, but sometimes they don't even do that. Yeah. Sometimes it's down to the Greyhound bus station, and some guy who claims he's 18, 19 years old, I'll take care of you, you don't need your parents, entices them to come. And again, the parents don't even figure it out for a while. And by the time we recover them, the damage, the psychological damage, and even the physical damage is immense. It's an absolutely horrific thing to see. It's a horrible problem.
Oh, it is. We did a show on the Epstein issue yesterday, and the guests knew some of the girls that were in his high school when he was a high school student that were victims of Epstein, and he said that they're traumatized for life. Well, we got questions in the audience over there, so we'll take a question from the live audience. Rob's our host. Go ahead, Rob.
Hey, Hey, John, how you doing? So I got a quick question for you. What does it look like as far as logistics go? Like what this seems like a monumental task, and it obviously is. What do we have the resources, manpower, money, logistics? Do we have enough of that to be able to combat this, and to try to find these kids? Because it seems like it's going to take a lot.
The answer is no to the first two things you said, and I'll tell you what the other problem is. The third problem, which we really don't talk about at all because we talk so much about getting the children back, is the lack of resources once you get them back. And this may be one of the biggest problems of all. So no, we do not have nearly enough resources to find them. We don't have enough resources, even if we find them, to recover them. And then we absolutely do not have the resources necessarily to take care of them. I'm going to be at a gala for an organization called Saving Innocence over the weekend. Saving Innocence is one of the few projects, it's based out of Los Angeles, that actually deals with this problem, with the post-traumatic problem of providing counseling services and relocation services and protective services to both those who have been trafficked, and if their family members involved, if good family members involved, to help them to get them placed and get them taken care of. And if there aren't, trying to get them into families, foster type families that really care and will go through the process of healing. But Saving Innocence is one of the few. And again, it's one of the areas, as I said, I think probably because the problem is so immense, probably because there are language barriers here, not obviously for domestic, but certainly for Asians coming over, from any of the Asian countries coming into California, certainly from those kids coming over the border. English is not a language, let alone a second or third language. So there's a lot of barriers, to find them. It's not like we can put up signs. You've probably seen on Facebook that there are, there's these reels now where they show you, if a girl is in trouble, if a young woman is in trouble, certain signs that she'll make with her hands to alert other people that they're in trouble. But if you don't speak the language, if you don't read the posters, how are you going to know? For all the kids you see in a given day with a parent, how are you going to know if any of those kids have been trafficked in any way? It's nearly impossible. So no, we don't have the resources necessary.
Yeah, we don't. We'll talk about that. We'll hear from Holman in the next segment about that issue because he's reaching out to everybody. That's what he means by America's mission. It means American citizens. He needs our help too, and they need to establish national and regional and state task forces that brings all these organizations together, including the NGOs that can work it, and people like you, John, and then put out the information. You can't just do it on TV interviews, and I really haven't seen anything yet. I mean, they've only been in place a month and a half or so I could give a break on that. But still, this is a challenge that we've been thinking about for a long, long time. Let's take one more question before we go to the break. Go ahead, Rob.
All right, Colonel, we have Cookie. Cookie, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. Question I had, in my years of law enforcement, I was hardly ever got any training in this. What can be done to better educate law enforcement? And then is there anything that you could see legislatively that could be done that could put a major hit into all these different ranks?
Well, one thing that can be done, as the Colonel just mentioned, is databasing. One of the biggest problems we have is we don't have systematic databases across the country that we can refer to. Look, you don't want, every time you see, say, an Asian child with white parents, you don't want to be pulling them aside and asking them for ID. That's not what this country is all about. That could be an adopted child. That could be a number of things. We don't want to be in that business. But there are specific signs of distress that children show, especially as they're older. There are very specific signs of distress. One of the issues, of course, is that if you're being sex trafficked, chances are you're not going outside. So in neighborhoods, for example, if you see that somebody has several children, but those children are not leaving the home, they're not going outside, they're not playing, that's at least a red flag. And we've got to be more vigilant with individuals, with people in neighborhoods. We have to take this out of being something that goes on over there. We used to think of drugs as being something that went on over there in the ghetto, on the streets. We used to think of people shooting up heroin as being somebody who's living on the streets. What we have found over the years, and this applies entirely to human trafficking, is that this can be your next door neighbor. There are functional addicts, just like there are functional, quote unquote, families where child trafficking and abuse is involved. And so we've got to take this out of the realm of being something that happens way over there or happens in these poorer, neighborhoods, et cetera. This happens in every neighborhood. And if you look at, for example, the arrest records, from the bust, like even in Scottsdale, the Scottsdale bust, I think, is very telling because most of the people busted in the Scottsdale, the 200 people busted, were in no way, shape, or form lower middle class. This was upper middle class to upper class individuals. A lot of this goes on in upper classes. And so we've got to train people what to look for. Again, we have to put out signs. One of the things they do, for example, in Las Vegas, because of the trafficking numbers, is that everywhere you go, in hotels, in restaurants sometimes, and all over the airport, they have signs up about how to spot human trafficking, to make people more aware, more vigilant about this. But also police forces have got to create task forces where this is necessary.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've got to take our last break. When we come back, we'll hear from Tom Homan and Dr. Phil. Again, I can't believe Dr. Phil has become a MAGA advocate, especially on this issue, and is trying to help. I'll be right back with John Thaler on The Rob Maness Show.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they have access to all your data? Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldviewtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
But what we can do is deputize every New Yorker, deputize every American to become our eyes and ears. Deputize every one of them to start looking and saying, you know what, that child looks forlorn. That child looks like they don't have someone that's shepherding them, caring for them. They're looking over their shoulder constantly like they're intimidated. We can tell them what to look for and tell them what to do if they're seeing something. I've been talking about that for a couple months now because I really truly believe, I agree, I've been, most every speech I give, I said we need to deputize every American up look for these kids. Why? Because I think every parent in this nation has that innate ability to recognize when something's not right with a child. I know I do. When you see something's just not right, whether you see a child in a workplace that shouldn't be there, or whether you see a child with an adult that there's something just you key on that something isn't right here. And of course, the left says, well, you're going to have 1,000 people call making reports on innocent people. If one report out of 1,000 saves a child, I think it's worth it.
And it's so important, as you said, that deputizing would come with giving people information of what to look for. What are the signs? What are the indicators? Because these children are our neighbors. They're in a household. You may see them in the wintertime with a windbreaker on, not properly dressed. You may see traffic coming through constantly. If we give everyday Americans and New Yorkers the information to look for, they will help us find these young people.
And what is it we're telling them to look for? I mean, for example, if you see young children, and let's say they're not in the sex trade. That's what everybody thinks about first, but a lot of it's slave labor. If you see young children doing work that you think, that child's too young to be doing that work. Even if they're in a hotel and they're dragging big bundles of sheets and laundry and you go, wow, that doesn't look right. That child shouldn't be doing that kind of work. It doesn't look right. It's probably not right. That's probably not just a young 19-year-old or whatever. Then what should they do?
Well, like we see a child that's, child's not going to school.
Right.
You don't see the child outside playing because you're under control. Things like that, where you see that child's just not living a normal life. He's under control by somebody. Make a phone call to the ICE tip line. Make a phone call to NYPD. Just say that something's just...
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Truth Thursday, and we're telling the truth about these hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million. There may be a million kids worldwide or more that are missing in these trafficking systems because of illegal immigration across various countries' borders, especially America's border. And my guest today is attorney John Thaler from Arizona, who works these issues. John, Tom Homan and Mayor Adams and Dr. Phil were talking about the indicators, and that's what I was getting at. Like you said, they hang posters all over Las Vegas because of the trafficking numbers that are there. Well, we know that the numbers of illegals and kids and those kind of things are really high in our major blue cities. So every subway station, every store could have a pamphlet on it that says, here's what to look for.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of them started to do. But, as I said, it works both ways. They have been teaching young girls now how to give signals to people. So if they're being taken somewhere, if they're being forced to go somewhere, they can give kind of a hand signal behind their back, to show that it's kind of their version of an SOS. We all have to be vigilant to look at these things, to see these things, to be willing to at least get involved to the point of calling police if we have to. But the other things that they said are the things that I was saying before, is that, when things look out of place, they often are. And when you see a child, oftentimes whose language is different than the parents, who doesn't come outside, who, if they come outside, it's barely through the front door, doesn't play with the other kids, doesn't play in the yard, doesn't do the normal things that kids do, chances are there's something wrong there. If the parents, shy away and don't come out very often, that's another sign. So there's a lot of signs, and the real trick here is to teach these to people, is to incorporate this, for example, in Neighborhood Watch. Neighborhood Watch, we look for people breaking into houses, but we really didn't ever train anybody to look for human traffic. We can upgrade our Neighborhood Watch programs to deal with these things. You can give presentations at churches, at synagogues, etc., about all of this. And certainly for our own children, to teach them, how to deal with this if something happens to them, if they can get a signal out. If they can't, then what to do if they're somehow captured in this. The other thing too is that we've got to work with Central American countries, South American countries especially, same thing, where the children have to be taught, what to do, what kind of like a hand signal to give, something they can do to other adults, whether it be at a border crossing station, whether it be at a school they're put into, or whether it just be because they're at the supermarket, but signals that they can learn to give. But it doesn't start when they get into this country. It starts when they're abroad, when they're in their home country, before they ever get here. And so the greater we give an education to kids at the youngest possible age overseas or over the border, the more likely they're going to be able to handle themselves correctly when they get here. And remember, the kids fear things, so that they've been threatened. They've been told that their parents will be killed. They've been told that they might be killed. So you have to deal with all of these traumas in advance. You have to explain to them what will happen if they are trafficked, what they can expect to hear, and that they although they're going to be frightened, to not believe it, to not be prevented from giving signals, because most of them, that's what happens. They are literally brainwashed into thinking that they're going to be killed or their family are going to be killed if they tell anybody. So it's an across-the-board problem. And to me, like I said, you certainly can view it here, but it also has to start in the countries that are sending kids to us.
Well, yeah, I mean, they teach us in POW training that it's the initial capture phase that's the easiest to get out of, and I could overlay that on this system. The initial taking phase of these kids is probably where the least professional people are. They're probably paid workers and those kind of things that are just doing what they're told, and getting in and taking them in, putting them into the system where the pros are, where they're running these underground railroads, shipping conduits, and those kind of things. Do we have we haven't really talked about this, and I understand you're a southern border kind of person where you live, but this is a problem at the northern border too. I mean, it's not just the southern border, is it?
Yeah, with Canada, it's two issues. One is is you have a lot of Asian children coming in through Canada, where they'll come in through Vancouver or the ports, along British Columbia, and then are brought down over the border. We talk a little bit because the president has talked a lot about the fentanyl coming over the Canadian border. That's an issue, but an issue that he hasn't really addressed much and should be is, again, the human trafficking. The other part of that, too, is also exploitative. We think of this as being, a lot of slave labor, especially coming over from Mexico. But you also get the same kind of exploitation with Canadians, bringing Canadian women, Canadian girls, teenagers over the border. Same thing. It's the one part of our partnership with Canada that's kind of a problem, is that we just don't think if everybody coming across that border is Caucasian, we don't really give it a lot of look. And that may be kind of a way in which we racially profile that is something that obviously drives us. It's just something we're used to. We all talk so much about the Mexican border, but the Canadian border has a very similar set of problems. Obviously not to the numbers that we have on our southern border, but it also has the same problem. And again, both from Asians coming through the ports there, and also younger and preteen and teenage girls coming through as well for sex trafficking.
Yeah, before we end the show here, talk a little bit about what you know about the resources available from a law enforcement perspective, an intelligence perspective, and how those capabilities either do or do not work. The film that I was referred to earlier from Age Studios that told the story of the brother and sister that were trafficked out of, I think it was Colombia. The individual was basically forced out of his law enforcement agency to go do this on his own and to find donors to help him do it, this kind of work. Have we improved there in that capability, or are we still kind of mired in that, and we need to try to advocate for and get more structure built that can address this and focus on it instead of it being kind of like a part-time job thing, which is what the impression I get.
Look, it's a combination. You need to train law enforcement better to deal with this, to deal with abductions of children, to deal with this even in the family court systems. The problem is that the police are very poorly trained in these areas altogether. Some law enforcement agencies like Las Vegas PD has this, Clark County, which is the county where Las Vegas has this, Los Angeles County and the LAPD have this, New York has this as well. But one of the biggest problems that you have is this problem of lack of coordination. So if you bring a child in, say through Oakland, Alameda, in California, and you bring that child across state lines, say into Utah or into Nevada or into Arizona, the child is lost through that system. So one of the problems here is that we really need to have state by state, individual states create task forces, absolutely. And then those task forces, like Attorney General's offices, need to be able to constantly communicate with each other, update their databases, update their intelligence gathering, et cetera. The other problem, too, is that this gets caught up in the politics. And the reason this happened so badly under Biden was obviously because of the politics. Whether you call it the replacement theory or anything else, there is clearly a political bend on not closing the borders. And, just an absolute oblivious nature for Democrats in general, but certainly for the Biden administration on what problems they were causing and how severe this is. You would think that this wouldn't, get by people, but it obviously does. So trying to get the politics out of all of this is a huge deal. And so far, I think we certainly would get a failing grade. If people haven't seen it, Sound of Freedom is actually an excellent movie to watch about this. And there's several others that have shows that have portrayed this, I think, very accurately, and they're worth watching to really get an understanding of how bad this is and how pervasive it is.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that the Trump administration will make some improvements rapidly to formalize a lot of this activity and prioritize it. Obviously, the priorities on the deportation operation and finding these kids right now, but that should lead to some permanent infrastructure being built and used so that we have a system that identifies this immediately and can get these, especially the kids, out of that trafficking network as quickly as possible and get them returned to their families or to safety if they don't have a family, and shut those networks and systems down. Well, John, thank you very much for joining me today. We appreciate it. Tell folks how they can find you real quick before we get to the end of the show. You got about 20 seconds.
Yeah, no, they can find me at Thaler ESQ, THALER ESQ on X. And they can find Report to the Governor, the book, but also other things about that at reporttothegovernor.com. And then our organization that deals with finding missing and abducted children is the McKinley Project, one word, themckinleyproject.org. They can find that online as well, and it gives a lot of information, and it ties to other resources as well to try to help abducted and missing children.
All right, thank you very much. Attorney John Thaler, folks. Well, next week, I'm going on vacation, but we will be playing Best Of. Monday is More War Monday. And then the following Monday, John Conrad. We're going to talk about Marine supremacy and fighting that war and what America needs to do. And as you've probably heard the president said, I'm starting a shipbuilding office in the National Security Council wing of the White House to put some focus and priority on that, because we don't have enough ships to win a war if we had to go to war with China. And that makes us weak, and we can't deter them. I'll see you then. I'm Rob Maness.
You're watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.